you. Thank you, Manjushri. First, a word of apology. Please forgive me if I sit while speaking this evening, okay? And I'll try to keep within the limit of an hour. My wife tells people whenever she has the chance that as a professor, I'm one of those people who's paid to talk for an hour, right? So I try to keep within those limits. I sometimes fail, but I'll try tonight and hope to leave time for questions, okay? Before I begin, let me ask, just out of curiosity, how many folks in the room tonight have been to Wutai Shan? Quite a few. This is what I anticipated. How many of you had visions of Manjushri while you were at Wutai Shan? Did you at least see multicolored clouds while you were there? I did that. I did not meet Manjushri himself, but I saw tokens of his presence in the form of multicolored clouds in the sky, which is a phenomenon often reported in early accounts of Wutai Shan by Chinese visitors and visitors from other parts of Asia. Since my remarks tonight pertain both to Manjushri and to Wutai Shan, the two are distinct topics, but of course closely related, since Manjushri is widely regarded as residing at Wutai Shan, even today. But I thought I'd begin by talking first about, let me pull my up here. First about Manjushri, and then we'll segue into to Wutai Shan and conclude with a focus on one particular text dealing with Wutai Shan. As you may know, there were several accounts of Wutai Shan and of famous monks and events that occurred at Wutai Shan, several of them that have been preserved in the Buddhist canon. And from one of them, compiled by the third patriarch of the Huayan school, Fa Zhang, there's a biography of a particular monk who lived in Wutai Shan. And I thought we'd zero in on that text to get something of the flavor of the original literature connected with the place and with its resident deity. But let me begin with something that may not be well known to all of you, although in this audience that may not be the case. You may already be familiar with everything I'm going to say tonight. But let me begin by making an exaggerated point. We all think of Manjushri as a bodhisattva. He isn't a bodhisattva. He's a Buddha masquerading as a bodhisattva. Right? And I'll tell you why I say that. That one of the earliest Mahayana texts, sutras, early in the history of Mahayana in South Asia, but also one of the first Mahayana texts translated into Chinese back in the Eastern Han Dynasty, the 2nd century AD, is a text known in Sanskrit as the Ajatashatru Kaukritya Vinodana. Let me pull this up. There's the title, the mouthful of Sanskrit there, translatable as the discourse on the dispelling of Ajatashatru's remorse. Everybody knows who Ajatashatru was. He's one of the villains of the Buddhist story, the son of King Bimbisara, a devout Buddhist king, but a son who ended up killing his father by imprisoning him until death, and who was therefore guilty of two very serious crimes: patricide, killing the father, and regicide, killing the king. He had been put up to this by other famous figures who were regarded as enemies of Buddhism in his day. But later in his career, many texts tell us he repented and was eventually accepted into the Buddhist fold. And this text, dispelling his remorse, is about that. But it's also a text which has some very interesting things to say about Manjushri. So just read this with me here. It's a sutra set, as many of the Buddha's discourses, Shakyamuni's discourses, were set on the slopes of Vulture's Peak, Gridvakuta, right? And on one occasion, Shakyamuni Buddha was holding forth to an assembly of bodhisattvas, Shravakas, and others. And at the same time, Manjushri arrived nearby on the opposite slope of the Vulture's Peak, and he held forth to a company of 25 bodhisattvas who had arrived there with him, demonstrating the superiority of his understanding of Buddhism to his fellow bodhisattvas. It was a kind of contest between him and the 25 other bodhisattvas who came with him to that site, and he showed himself to be, in the depth of his wisdom, superior to them all. And once he had demonstrated that, he traveled around the other side of Vulture's Peak, where Shakyamuni was holding forth. Shakyamuni having just returned from his daily begging rounds and was eating. Manjushri, as I say here, engaged with the 25 other bodhisattvas in a kind of contest in which he demonstrates the superiority of his understanding of the Dharma. Thereafter, he joins Shakyamuni's assembly, and with the Buddha's approval, proceeds to teach himself. The Buddha in this sutra is very gracious towards Manjushri, and this surprises the Shakyamuni's audience, particularly people like Shariputra, who are always uncomfortable in the presence of bodhisattvas, right? And after he speaks to the audience, with the Shakyamuni's permission, he asks to share the food in Shakyamuni's begging bowl. And this causes Shariputra and others no end of upset. They're astounded at the impudence of this person asking to partake of Shakyamuni's food, whereupon Shakyamuni tells them a story, an agama, right? In the course of his preaching, he actually accuses Shakyamuni of ingratitude for not willingly sharing his alms food with him. And this was perceived by Shakyamuni's followers to be a kind of insult to Shakyamuni. He goes on to best all of the Shravakas in the assembly in a contest of magical powers that involves the use of a begging bowl, the magical use of a begging bowl, which he says to other parts, sends to other places in the cosmos, right? Let's see. And at this point, Shakyamuni tells the tale I'm about to summarize for you, of one of his own past lives, Shakyamuni's pre-Buddha lives, in which a monk named Jnanaraja, right, the king of wisdom, making use of a begging bowl, converts a young boy named Vimalabahu to the way, to Buddhism. At the end of the tale, Shakyamuni reveals that the boy, Vimalabahu, was none other than himself in a previous life. Vimalabahu was one of the previous lives of Shakyamuni. But then he also reveals that the monk who introduced this boy to the practice of Buddhism and thereby started him off on the Bodhisattva path was none other than, guess who? Manjushri, right? From this, Shakyamuni draws the lesson that all the qualities of Buddhahood that he and countless other Buddhas possess are owed to the grace of Manjushri, whom he calls at several points in the text, and this is repeated in other sutras, including the Huayan Sutra, Manjushri is called the father and mother of, I've said, there's a misprint here. It's the father and mother of Buddhas, of countless Buddhas, not bodhisattvas. And this last remark anticipates even stronger claims made in later texts like the Huayan Jing, in which it said that Manjushri is the eternal mother of all the incalculable billions of Buddhas. Now you know how one embarks initially on the bodhisattva path. A Buddha introduces you to Buddhism. And since Vimalabahu, later to become Shakyamuni Buddha, was introduced to the practice of Mahayana Buddhism by Manjushri, then known as Jnana Raja, we can conclude, and the Buddhist tradition reading this sutra concludes, that Manjushri was really a Buddha who took on the guise of a bodhisattva. Right? This is an important fact about Manjushri, and one of the reasons why he is so highly esteemed in the Mahayana tradition, often called, for example, the king of the Buddhas. Right? And it's one of the reasons why Chinese, once they determined that Manjushri was living in China rather than in some distant Pure Land, one of the reasons the Chinese were so proud to have this Buddha pretending to be a bodhisattva living in their realm. One of the things that's usually said about Manjushri in the enormous literature connected with Manjushri and in the art associated with him, one of the things that's often reported about him is that he was, in a personal appearance, very young. One of his epithets, in fact, is Kumarabhuta, which means young man or crown prince. And in the art associated with Manjushri from all over Asia, he's often depicted as a youthful figure. Now, this is a particularly beautiful statue from Java, excavated in a farmer's field outside of Yogyakarta only about 50 years ago. Solid silver statue about this high, showing the youthful Kumarabhuta or Manjushri, and many images of him, particularly those found in South Asia and East Asia, depict him as a young man of grace. The term Manjushri, his name, can be translated as something like winsome splendor. The word Manjushri suggests a physically attractive appearance, and we often see him. This ancient figure, who was mother and father to countless Buddhas of the past, is depicted often as a very young person in the literature and in the art. And that's part of the fascination, I think, of this particular figure. Some other examples, which I won't dwell on, just to show you how he's often represented in South Asia and East Asia. We also know Manjushri because of roles he plays in other scriptures. And you can probably all identify this as an illustration of the climactic chapter of the Vimalakirti Sutra, in which Manjushri, shown on the viewer's right here, is in dialogue with the sage Vimalakirti. They sit on platforms facing each other. Famous scene, sort of the culmination of the narrative of the Vimalakirti Sutra. That sutra and Manjushri's role in it is another of the important facets of his remarkably varied career, right? And this often gets represented in Buddhist art. This is a photograph of a book. You can see the page opening here, but the book contains photographs of paintings at Dunhuang, where Manjushri, particularly in this role as in dialogue with Vimalakirti, is often represented. Other examples zeroing in on him, you can't see Vimalakirti in this image, but this is a detail from another depiction of the dialogue between Vimalakirti and Manjushri. You'll notice that Manjushri, in this and other cases, is seated usually on a lion. It is his conventional mount. It's very often the case in Mahayana Buddhism that prominent bodhisattvas have animals on which they sit, and Manjushri's animal is the lion. Samantabhadra, who's often paired, as you know, in the Huayan Sutra and elsewhere with Manjushri, is usually shown seated on an elephant. But Manjushri's mount is a lion. There are other figures in this image that we'll return to in a moment who are worth special notice. Another example from Dunhuang, a later period of that dialogue scene between Manjushri on the right and Vimalakirti on the left. Still another detail from such an image, again mounted on a lion. Still one more. There are scores of these images at Dunhuang and elsewhere. Now, you know, if you've read the Vimalakirti Sutra, Manjushri is the last of the figures who engage in a conversation or debate or inquiry with Vimalakirti. And he's given that position as the last of Vimalakirti's dialogue partners because Manjushri is commonly regarded as embodying in a special degree the preeminent Buddhist virtue of wisdom, or prajna. We'll see more of that later. And yet, in the context of the Vimalakirti Sutra, he is bested in the debate by Vimalakirti, which is part of the interesting irony. The wisest of bodhisattvas shows himself to be not quite up to a dialogue with this layman. Right? Other examples in different artistic traditions of Manjushri seated on, in this case, a lotus throne, which is itself perched on the back of a lion. You take a note of that small dark-skinned figure in the foreground who is holding the leash of the lion. He's sometimes called the Kunlun Nu, the Malay slave. No one seems to know exactly how that dark-skinned figure came to be a part of the retinue of Manjushri, but he appears very often in the early depictions of Manjushri as his groom, his servant holding the tether of the lion. Interestingly, in later times, he is replaced by a different figure, a Central Asian figure, who is identified as one of the kings of Khotan. And that's an interesting story in itself. This is another particularly gorgeous image of Manjushri, not taken from any particular sutra, but just presenting him in all of his glory, holding the wand, the wish-fulfilling wand, that is often one of the things he's shown to be holding. In other contexts, other artistic representations, he's shown to be holding a sword in one hand and a book in the other. But in this tradition of representing him in all his glory, he holds a Rui wand, a wish-fulfilling wand. But here he is with mounted on a particularly fierce lion, being shown, may not be evident, but this is a Japanese painting, and the figure there is sort of boyish by the standards of Japanese artistic representation, again emphasizing his youthfulness, but he's holding a sword, which is the symbol of wisdom. Prajna is often said to be sword-like insofar as it is incisive. It cuts through ignorance and reveals the truth of things. And on the other hand, he holds a book which is usually identified as one of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Another example of him holding, in this case, a sword in one hand and the book resting on a lotus with his other hand, and a curious arrangement of his hair, 5 tufts, I guess you'd call them, seated on each one is a miniature Buddha. And this derives from other literature connected with Manjushri. This finally takes us close to Wutai Shan. This is a Dunhuang painting, taken, I'm afraid, from a book, as you can tell, which shows Manjushri seated on the viewer's left, yes, to the right of of the Buddha, who is identified either as Shakyamuni or Shakyamuni in his Huayan transformation as Vairochana Buddha, right? And on the other side, the viewer's right, the Buddha's left, is Samantabhadra, seated on his elephant, a curious-looking elephant. The lion and the elephant, you'll notice, their feet, their paws are resting on lotus blossoms. And they are said to be seated in one of the famous monasteries located not in Wutai Shan proper, but as some of you may know, on the outskirts of Wutai Shan. It's identified, this is the Foguang Si, the Buddha Radiance Monastery on the outskirts of Wutai Shan. Shown here with the Huayan Trinity, Vairochana Buddha flanked by Manjushri and Samantabhadra, as though they resided in that precinct, which is thought they did. Other art associated with Manjushri connects him also, particularly with Wutai Shan. There are stories repeated over and over again in the literature connected with Manjushri, which tell of an Indian pilgrim, excuse me, an Indian pilgrim monk who also became a translator of texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, named Buddhapali, who visited China in the 7th century and traveled, as many Indians did even that early on. People from South Asia and East Asia flocked to China as pilgrims to Wutai Shan, which by the 6th century had become a prominent pilgrimage site because Manjushri was believed to reside there. Buddhapali came, and while he was traveling among the peaks at Wutai Shan, he met an old man, the story goes, usually shown as a very old man with a staff bent over. And the story is that this old man asked Buddhapali if he had a copy of a particular sutra. And Buddhapali said, regrettably, he did not have that. But he turned around, went back to India, we're told, got a copy of the Sanskrit text, brought it back to China and revisited Wutai Shan and discovered that the old man who had met him and asked for that text was none other than Manjushri in disguise as an old man. So you often see this combination of figures that you see in this example, a woodblock print. Manjushri on his lion in all of his glory with his double nimbus, flaming nimbus, holding a sword with maybe a blossom on its point. And to the upper right of that figure, from our viewer's point of view, is that old man, Manjushri in disguise, with his staff. To the left, we see the top of those two figures on our left is, can anyone guess who that is? That's Sudana, the boy novice bodhisattva who figures so prominently in the Gandavyuha Sutra and is commonly depicted as, if you know the Gandavyuha Sutra, Sudana's meeting, he meets twice with Manjushri, and that's a very important element of the scripture. And he appears in this. And the other figure on the lower left is a devotee, it is Buddha Pali in his role as a devotee. This combination, and behind him you'll see 5 peaks, Wutai Shan, right? The mountains of the 5 peaks or 5 pavilions. Right? So I've identified these figures here, right? Sudana, Manjushri's archetypal disciple from the Gandavyuha Sutra, the Indian pilgrim monk Buddha Pali, translator of the very important Dharani text that may be familiar to some of you, Sarva Durgati Parishodhana Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani, who is said to have encountered Manjushri while visiting Wutai Shan in the 670s and again in the 680s. And then there's that barbarian groom holding the leash of the lion, but he's no longer a dark-skinned Malay figure. He's dressed in Central Asian clothing and comes to be identified as the king of Khotan. The cult of reverence of Manjushri flourished in Khotan in Tang Dynasty times, and Khotan had a particularly important diplomatic and cultural relationship with Tang China, which partly accounts for this figure appearing in the iconography of Wutai Shan. And then the elderly sage, Manjushri himself in the guise of an old man. Many examples of this. This is a Chinese block print from the 10th century, which shows the same set of 5 figures, Manjushri himself and the other 4. It's not so easily seen in this photograph, but the central panel within this larger panel shows that same scene. Manjushri seated front and center, and the other 4 figures in the foreground. 2 bodhisattvas flanking the larger image. This is an image within an image, I think you can tell, right? A painting within a larger mural painting. This is another example of the same scene from a place near Dunhuang called Yulin, about 35 miles northeast, I think, of Dunhuang. There's another set of caves richly decorated with Buddhist art, and Manjushri figures there in several instances. Here's a better photograph of the detail of that larger image. And it shows those same figures again. So Manjushri as the presiding deity at Wutai Shan, who is visited by people from afar, from South Asia like Buddha Pali, from Central Asia like the king of Khotan, and who is of course linked to the Huayan Sutra, in which Sudana is himself a pilgrim who encounters Manjushri. This image was particularly popular, this theme was particularly popular in Japanese Buddhist art, and here's a Japanese painting showing the same, and miniature sculptures showing the same set of 5 figures. Another Japanese set of sculptures. This you may recognize as something which in medieval times in China, visitors to Wutai Shan received as a kind of memento of their visit to Wutai Shan. We might call it a talisman. When pilgrims went to Wutai Shan, they were given or they acquired pieces of paper like this with 4 imprints on it as to commemorate their and to remind them of their blessing in having visited Wutai Shan. And in the figure itself, those same figures appear, and there's a description beneath, which I've given here in transcription. I'm having trouble reading it, and I'm sure you are too, but Here's a translation of that inscription. The great sage Manjushri Bodhisattva, in universal encouragement of devotion to him, worship of him, and faith in him, in these 5 terraced mountains, Wutai Shan, the true figure of the sage, Manjushri as he really is in all of his glory, appears in multiple manifestations, the text says. So unfathomable is the awesome spirit, his awesome spirit, that although he long ago achieved true awakening, he has never abandoned great compassion. Concealing his dharma, his true body, his dharma dhatu, his fashan, he manifests himself in the guise, literally shows the marks of a god or a man. He looks like a divinity, right? Together with a myriad of other bodhisattvas, he resides in the clear and cool mountains, Qingliangshan, another name for Wutai Shan, captivating and transforming beings according to their particular conditions, his benefices spreading far and wide, with expansive thought. This is addressed to the holder of the talisman. With expansive thought, contemplate an increase of blessings, make obeisance to him and praise him, and you will be able to fulfill all your aspirations. All 4 orders of the faithful, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, are encouraged to worship him and take refuge in him so that in the future they may all realize the wondrous fruition of awakening. At about the time pilgrimage to Wutai Shan was becoming especially popular in the Tang Dynasty, that was also the time, the late Tang, when what we call esoteric Buddhism, Mijiao, what came to be known in Japan as Shingon Buddhism, was flourishing. And elements of esoteric Buddhism came to be combined with elements of Huayan Buddhism at about this period. So you see at the end of this inscription on the talisman 2 mantras that are associated with Manjushri. They are, in a sense, vocal embodiments of the person of Manjushri. One very famous, Arapachana, which happens also to be the first 5 letters of a medieval Sanskrit alphabet, right, or syllabary, and is thought to be a particularly powerful mantra or dharani. But also another more complex dharani, Om Avirahum Ka Chara, which is an embodiment of the deity known as Yamantaka in the esoteric Buddhist pantheon, who is understood to be one of the many manifestations of Manjushri. Make appropriate offerings before this image, and with your innermost mind focused on this one object, concentrate on dedication of merit to sentient beings so that they may all take refuge in constant bliss. By the thousands, people return from their visits to Wutai Shan with a talisman like this in their possession, which is a reminder of, among other things, how popular the cult of Manjushri and the cult of Wutai Shan was among the populace at large. Manjushri is the embodiment of wisdom in Mahayana Buddhism and is possessed of the deepest possible understanding of the profundities of Mahayana thought, but he's also an object of popular reverence to people at large who may have been illiterate and certainly were not familiar with the intricacies of Huayan thought. Right? One other, for me at least, surprising manifestation of Manjushri is one I came upon fairly late in my study of Wutai Shan and of Manjushri. A particular form of Manjushri that at first sight is often mistaken for an image of Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara Guanyin is often shown with 1,000 arms and hands, right? In each hand, an eye in the palm of each hand. That's Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara, one of the common images of that bodhisattva in the Mahayana tradition. And there's an image of Manjushri that I'm about to show you, which at first glance remind you of that because it shows a multiple-armed Manjushri. It's based on a text, the long title of which is given here, perhaps translatable as The Great Tantra of the Thousand Arms and Thousand Bowls of Manjushri, the ocean of adamantine nature of Mahayana Yoga. This is a kind of a text that derives from the early stages in the evolution of esoteric Buddhism. Scholars now universally agree, it's an apocryphon. It's a text that pretends to have been translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, but seems actually to have been composed with bits and pieces borrowed from other Indian sources, but composed in China. It's attributed, part of it, to Vajrabodhi, one of the earlier missionaries of esoteric Buddhism to China, but finished by Amoghavajra, his successor in the transmission of esoteric Buddhism, with the collaboration of a Korean monk who was a disciple of those tantric teachers in China. All three names are associated with this text and traditionally understood to have been responsible for creating it. It's a fairly lengthy text that has not been well studied. And it seems not to have circulated widely in China, but to have been for a short time very important in northern China and in Dunhuang. Let's see some examples. This is a large silk banner, the central figure of which is the Buddha Vaishajya Guru, a depiction of his paradise, the medicine Buddha, whom I'm sure you all know, now in the Stein collection from Dunhuang. But if you can see in the upper area of this image, there are two smaller figures, and one of them is Manjushri with 1,000 arms, whereas Avalokiteshvara has 1,000 arms, and in the palm of each hand you see an eye. In Manjushri's case, each of Manjushri's hands holds a begging bowl, which is a kind of recollection of the way in which Manjushri was first introduced to China in that text I described to you, the Ajatasattu Sutra, where a begging bowl plays a particularly important role. And in the sutra, Manjushri wields begging bowls to magical effect. Another example here. I have a list of 16 different caves at Wutai Shan, which have mural paintings of this particular version of Manjushri. And here's a photograph of the wall of one of the caves, Cave 14 at Dunhuang, which shows that image to the right. Another example from Cave 14. I sometimes refer to this as Manjushri mille bras, using the French word meaning 1,000 arms. Everything sounds more elegant in French, we know that. Okay. Here he is again in a different mural but if you examine this very closely, you'll see that in each of the bowls that Manjushri holds, there is a miniature Mount Sumeru seated in the bowl. And on top of each miniature Mount Sumeru is the Buddha Shakyamuni, a recollection of the claim made about Manjushri as having been the progenitor of thousands of Buddhas. Right? Here's a detail of the lower slopes of those miniature, or of the Mount Sumeru on which Manjushri himself sits. And as is often the case, two Nagarajas, two serpent kings, Nanda and Upananda, they have names, have their serpent-like bodies twisted around the flank of Mount Sumeru. As subsidiary figures who often appear in this particular icon. And a bevy of other supporting figures who surround Manjushri in this very rich image. And also in many versions of this scene of Manjushri of 1,000 Arms and Begging Bowls, you see in the upper right and upper left small moon disk images of the goddess of the sun and the goddess of the moon, who often are part of this version of Manjushri's retinue. Other examples. It took me a long time to hit upon this particular version of Manjushri, who has not been, people are beginning to pay attention to it now, but for a long time it was not well studied. And people didn't know what to make of it or of the apocryphal text on which it's based. This is another silk banner from Dunhuang that's now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Detail, subordinate figures. This is an artistic representation of a famous monastery in the city of Taiyuan, Chongshansi. Right? This is a Ming painting. In Ming Dynasty, this was a particularly prominent monastery, very large, enjoying imperial support. You see a photograph of what it looks like today on a snowy day. And the main figures in the main building in this monastery are a triad of figures with Samantabhadra on the left and with Guanyin in the center, slightly larger, but with Manjushri on the other side of Avalokiteshvara. So this version of Manjushri's image is particularly to be found in Dunhuang, in the art of Dunhuang, but also in other places in northern China, like the capital city of Taiyuan at this monastery. There's a better image of Manjushri of 1,000 arms and 1,000 begging bowls, standing rather than seated on a lotus pot. Very imposing, much larger than life, these images. If you've ever visited this temple, I'm sure you'd be as impressed by it as I was. This is another famous temple at Wutai Shan, now regarded as the central temple of the Wutai Shan complex, the Shentong Si, which is a very complex, multi-building monastic establishment. And in one of the side rooms of that temple, is what must count, I'm afraid, as one of the ugliest representations of Manjushri with 1,000 arms, shown here. This statue was made by I don't know whom, sometime in the very late Qing dynasty. Shows him seated on a particularly clumsy-looking lion, but with the full set of 1,000 arms, each one holding a tiny begging bowl. But the iconography has, it seems, been confused because in this image alone, not in any other, he's shown to have 11 heads, which of course is something borrowed from the imagery of one of the versions of Guanyin. Right? And in that same room, below and to the side of that main image, is a somewhat more charming image of Buddha Pali holding a wand, of Manjushri in another gaze, seated on a lion in the guise of an old man. Okay, that gives you some impression of the role, the identity of part of the identity of, he's a multi-faceted figure, but I've introduced you to at least some of the facets of his story and of his image. There are many other things, if I had more than an hour, we could go into. But let me now move to something else here. Sometimes I teach courses on Chinese Buddhism, or I'm retired now, but I taught in the past courses on Chinese Buddhism that try to situate Buddhism in a larger comparative context. there is the theme often discussed by people working in comparative religion, the theme of holiness as a characteristic of, or a value recognized in a variety of Buddhist traditions. So I put together a little presentation here, which I'll give in the future to others, but I thought I'd share with you tonight, which focuses on a particular monk who lived in the late 6th, early 7th century, known as Jietuo, who is a monk of many parts. He's a visionary. He has visions that are reported in the biographies of him. He's also a meditation master, a chanshi, as he's referred to. He's a charismatic evangelist. In the biographies of this particular monk, we're told that thousands of people in the summer would come to Wutai Shan and camp out around Foguangsi, which was his temple, and he would minister to them, help feed them, and give sermons to them. And we could call him, among other things, an evangelist. But he was also a very strict observer of monastic discipline and was famous for that reason too, and came to be regarded, even before his death, as a living avatar, a living incarnation of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. And in his many parts, we see some of the dimensions of sainthood or the sacred personhood in Chinese Buddhism. I have here, if you'll allow me, a couple of sort of theoretical points to make about the topic of saintliness. And I begin by pointing out that it is well known in Buddhism that there are two orders of sentient beings in early Buddhism. There are ordinary persons, pratyajana, fanfu. An ordinary person is someone not on the path, not on the marga to liberation, someone who is mired in suffering, destined to be repeatedly reborn unless and until embarked on the path, distantly analogous to other figures, sinners and the like, in other religions like Christianity. The other category of sentient beings are the noble beings, the Aryas. Thank you. An Arya is someone who is embarked on the multi-stage path to liberation. And notice that the Sanskrit term Arya is commonly translated into Chinese using the word sheng, which of course has a usage outside of Buddhism in China. In Confucianism and in Taoism, sheng is usually translated as sage. But in Buddhist context, it doesn't mean quite what it means in Confucianism, for example. It means Arya, a noble being, someone who has undergone the kind of ontological change that makes one, after that change, fundamentally different from all other kinds of sentient beings. Okay. There are in Buddhism recognized different grades of sanctity or levels of Arya status, and I've mentioned some of them here. Probably these are categories are well known to you. There are stream winners. A stream winner is one who has entered the path and undergone the ontological change from ordinary to noble person. Then comes the once returner, one who has attained the penultimate rebirth. Then there is a non-returner, one who has been reborn into a final lifetime, and then an arhat, right, who has been released from rebirth entirely. That's one way of grading different levels of sanctity in early Buddhism. Sainthood, with the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, early in the Common Era, a new ideal of perfection or sainthood emerged in Buddhism, that of the Bodhisattva. Whereas arhatship earlier was thought to be, which earlier was thought to be the final culmination of the path, was understood to be the achievement of one's own final liberation from suffering and rebirth. The Mahayanist aspires to become not simply an arhat, as you all know, but a Buddha. Such an aspirant, the Bodhisattva, is stirred by an impulse to universal compassion and seeks not self-liberation, but the liberation of all sentient beings. And so rather than exist in samsara by attaining his own nirvana, he remains in samsara, working on behalf of suffering beings and manifesting himself to them in many times and places, like Wutai Shan, and in various forms, various incarnations, apparitions, visionary experiences. I spoke earlier at a different talk this morning about images of sacred figures in Buddhism. And one of the points I didn't mention, but I will mention here, is that an image of Manjushri, once it is created, undergoes a kind of consecration ritual that you may all know. The culmination of that ritual is the point at which the pupils of the eyes of the figure are painted in, right? And it's at that point that it's traditionally believed in Buddhism that the image is transformed from a mere stone or wooden image into an embodiment of the Buddha or Bodhisattva or figure represented. The eye-opening ceremony, as it's called, is a very important ceremony in Buddhism throughout Asia. If you're interested in a kind of evocative depiction of that ceremony as it's still practiced in Sri Lanka, there's a marvelous novel which I would recommend to you for lots of reasons, but in this case, particularly because of a scene in the novel. The novel is called Anil's Ghost. Does anyone know the novel? It was published about 30 years ago by a man named Ondaatje, who is a Dutch Sri Lankan figure who now lives in Canada and a prominent novelist. And he tells the story of a young woman, Anil is her name, who helps identify the corpses of people killed in the civil wars in Sri Lanka. But one figure who appears in the novel is an artist who's commissioned to reconstruct a huge colossal statue of the Buddha. And there's a very evocative scene in the novel in which early, just at dawn, he mounts the scaffolding so that he's standing right in front of the face of the Buddha and has a pot of paint and a brush and a young assistant, and he turns his back to the face of the Buddha and reaches over his shoulders and with the guidance of the young man, places dots of black paint in the pupils of the eyes. And the reason he turns his back at that moment is because it's assumed that once the statue becomes a living Buddha, it will produce a powerful ray of light that could blind someone who is looking straight at it. Very powerful image of this ritual and what it meant in Buddhism. So where are we? I'm skipping over something here. We're back now in the vicinity of Wutai Shan. Here are some depictions in painting and in photographs of Wutai Shan. If you visited the place, as many of you have, you'll recognize a number of these images. And there's one of those multicolored clouds that betoken the presence of Manjushri. There are many things that tell you Manjushri is living there. Bolts of lightning, discs of bright light that appear magically at night. The literature on Wutai Shan is full of reports of things like that. And one of the more commonly observed is the multicolored cloud. Now, back to Jetor, with whom I'm going to conclude here. This is a reliquary stupa located just outside, on the grounds surrounding the monastery outside of Wutai Shan, called Fogwangsa, the monastery of the Buddha's radiance. His remains were interred in this, Jetor's remains were interred in this monument. Here are, on the left, an aerial photo of the Buddha Light temple, and then earlier on the left, I think I'm screwing up again, but I can go back. On the right, a Dunhuang painting showing Fogwangsa in the imagination of Tang Dynasty Buddhist. Here we go. The principal sources of biography or hagiography of Jetwa are accounts of his life included in collections of hagiographies like the continued accounts of the lives of eminent monks and records of the transmission of the Huayan Sutra, the last of those composed by Fazang, the third patriarch of the Huayan tradition, and it's that particular biography that I'm referring to. And I'll just quote some passages from it that will give you some sense of who Jetwa was, what kind of sanctity or sainthood he embodies, and what the connection is between him and his sanctity on the one hand and Manjushri on the other hand. So this is the opening of Fazang's biography of Jetwa. Shi Jetwa of the Xing family of Wutai County in Dai Prefecture entered the Sangha at the age of 6. Unbounded in his resolve, he first sought instruction in concentration and renunciation under a meditation master prominent in his day named Hui Chao of a place called Clutch Belly Cliff, I love that name, west of Mount Jie, which is not too far from Wutai Shan. Especially gifted as a judge of human character, Chao, his meditation master, recognized Jetwa's refined talent and declared to the brethren, Jetwa's meditation practice is so surprisingly brilliant that none of you disciples can emulate him. He is not to be treated as one of the common lot by being assigned to routine Sangha duties. It was not long before Jetwa's insight into the utmost profundities had come to the verge of perfection. In his 18th year, he undertook to inquire broadly into the various systems of Buddhist thought. He was, among other things, a scholar monk and studied not only Huayan, but also other traditions like Tiantai and so forth. Consulting all the great worthies, both the new learning and the old interpretations, he ascended to the inner sanctum of erudition. After full ordination, he committed himself to strict observance of the monastic code, the Vinaya, and abruptly returned to his former residence at Buddha Radiance Mountain in the foothills southwest of Wutai. There, he established the monastery of the Buddha's Radiance, which he used as a venue for concerted practice. Twa continuously chanted the Lotus Sutra, the Huayan monk in the eyes of Fazang, but one of the sutras he routinely recites is the Lotus Sutra. And every day from dawn till dusk and without respite, he read the Flower Garland Sutra. On the basis of the Flower Garland Sutra, he formulated a particular kind of meditation known as the Buddha Radiance contemplation, which was apparently a kind of visualization meditation. Jetwa often traveled in search of Manjushri to the old temple of the great Buddha in the center of Wutai, located north of the flower garland that lies to the southeast of the central terrace. 2 or 3 times, he did succeed in having visions of the Bodhisattva. On the first such occasion, Manjushri disappeared as soon as Jetwa had made his prostrations. The next time, in a personally conferred admonition, Manjushri spoke to Jetwa, saying, "Why must you prostrate yourself before me? You should be ashamed of yourself. All that is necessary is awakened understanding." And this is a hint of an important theme that pops up in the tradition of Manjushri. There were bodies of opinion which downplayed the value of visionary Buddhism. A famous late Tang Chan master ridiculed pilgrims to Wutai Shan, hoping to actually see Manjushri, saying that that's not right at all. That's a kind of superstition. The real Manjushri is your deepest mind. So there was this tradition of sort of, what's the word we use, of dismissing what were perceived as superstitious elements of Buddhism and trying to concentrate on inner contemplation. And Manjushri seems to be himself saying that, appearing to Jetwa, noticing that Jetwa prostrates himself to the presence of Manjushri, and then criticizing Jetwa for doing so, right? Very complicated and ironic point being made here. Jetwa heeded the seed's message and accordingly searched within himself until he attained the realization of non-arising, Wushang, right? Anutpataka Dharma Shanti, at the same time experiencing the bliss of the Dharma. Thereafter, regretting the pursuit of solitary, that is selfish good, he set his heart on universal salvation, prayed sincerely for the great enlightenment, and sought to realize that thought of great enlightenment called the bodhicitta. Thereupon, in response, Buddhas appeared. We're not told which Buddhas, but several Buddhas appeared in another vision to Jetwa, who said to him, "Profound indeed is the truth of the Buddha's quiescence, vast kalpas of cultivation, and lo, it is achieved. If you could open and let this Dharma eye shine forth, all the Buddhas would rejoice." Jetwa then addressed a question to the sky, to heavenward, and said, "The truth of quiescence, can it be spoken so as to be taught to others?" The Buddhas who had just spoken to him then hid themselves away, and by voice alone, he couldn't see them anymore, but he could hear their voice, they declared, "The wisdom of expedience is a lamp revealing both the mind and objects, but of the ultimately true Dharma, there is nothing at all to be seen." Another kind of interesting paradoxical statement. We've just seen the vision, and those who appeared in the vision rebuked people for over-evaluating such visions. One last passage from this biography, and then I'll conclude. On one occasion, the provincial governor requested transmission of the fragrant precepts. The sort of bodhisattva ordination ritual was requested by a local governor. When the ceremony was over and Jetwa was preparing to head back east, he apparently gone to the provincial capital to administer the ceremony. He's going back to his temple now near Wutai Shan. But when the governor and the monks' disciples accompanied him to the city's eastern gate, it was then near sunset, and Jetwa feared that he would be unable to perform the usual evening service of burning incense and making offerings. He was abject with shame. But suddenly he heard a voice from above the city saying, "Think of your joined palms as flowers, your body as an offering, your good thoughts as true incense, your incantations as the rising fragrant smoke. All the Buddhas, smelling the aroma and following the sound, will cross over to you. If these and other such things are done conscientiously, there can finally be no suspicion of dereliction." At the time only Jetwa heard this voice, his resolve much strengthened from this point on, as his realization grew increasingly profound. You could see in this story of one prominent monk associated both with Manjushri and later held to be an incarnation of Manjushri, how complex his religious and intellectual life was. He's a strict observer of the Vinaya, afraid and ashamed that he might not be able to make it for the evening ritual if he left that late in the day from the city. He's a meditation master. He's a learned monk. It's said later in the biography that thousands of people would visit this monastery every summer, and he would have a kind of camp meeting of Mahayana Buddhists on the grounds. Multifaceted figure who combines meditation practice, in which, of course, like all Buddhist meditation practices, one realizes that all things, visualizations and other things, are empty, combines that insight into the emptiness of all things with powerful visual and oral encounters with a divine figure. You can see how complex a figure Manjushri is in the tradition. I wish I had time to give you other examples of this, but I hope that suffices to give you some sense of how rich a figure he actually is in connection with Wutai Shan. And thanks for your attention. I've left some time, it's a kind of miracle for me, I've left some time for questions, right? And I hope I have some of them.
Thank you so much, Professor Gimello, for that interesting talk. This is just a minor question. I'm wondering if you could shed light for us on how this Arapachana syllabary came to be associated with Manjushri.
I hate it when people ask me questions I don't know the answers to. Right? I really do not know how this came. The Arapachana set of syllables had a kind of non-religious function as the beginning of the standard Sanskrit syllabary, right? The ABCs of Sanskrit for Mahayana Buddhists. How exactly it came to be, I can speculate. I have some thoughts, but no evidence to support those thoughts, that Manjushri, remember he holds a book in one of his hands in many of his images. He's associated with the Prajnaparamita canon. And perhaps the first 4 letters in the Sanskrit syllabary or alphabet are associated with him insofar as he embodies the content of all those texts that were written in Sanskrit. That's just a theory. Maybe clever, maybe not, but it's the best I have in the way of an offer. There may be scholars working on this who have knowledge that I haven't yet discovered about this topic. What attracted you to the Arapachana Dharani? Have you encountered it elsewhere?
It's very mysterious. It seems to be the alphabet used in Gandhara, but not much is understood about where it came from. Yeah, it's very mysterious. And
I think there are parallels in Western culture where the ABCs, the opening letters of the alphabet in Indo-European languages, were given a kind of magical, accorded a kind of magical effect, right? But again, that's outside the range of my knowledge. Right? Anybody got a question I can answer? Right? I would be grateful. Right?
You made me want to go on pilgrimage to the mountain, and I'm just wondering, how was that journey for you? Was it exciting? Was it a pilgrimage? How was it for you?
Well, it was the way it is for college professors. My first visit was part of an attendance at an academic conference that was being held at Wutai Shan. But I was delighted to be at the place because I've been reading about it for years, and to actually see the place and walk around for hours to the various sites at Wutai Shan was a marvelous experience for me, right? I did not, as I said, have a vision of Manjushri. I did see, not on my first trip, but on a later trip, one of those multicolored clouds. Some some non-believer tried to bring me down, and he said, "You see those clouds? They're just contrails from a rocket that the Chinese army had sent aloft." And I refused to believe it, right? Right? Because people in the 6th and 7th century were seeing those clouds, and there were no rockets. And I've had the occasion to visit several times since. I think I've made 4 trips to Wutai Shan. Never for great length of time. I haven't lived there or participated in the life of monastics there. But I have spent on each visit, a week to 10 days, and would love to go back again. It's harder to do these days, even though traveling there is easier. It's a prominent vacation spot. So there, in the warmer weather, there are tens of thousands of people crowding in and around the center of Wutai Shan. So you have to either go in the winter, which is very hard to do because the weather is forbidding in the winter, or get up very early in the morning before the crowds accumulate. But there are good hotels there and great vegetarian food and even a beer that's called the Wutai Shan beer, which is quite good. Right. So I recommend it. Go, please go. Right. Yeah. Right.
Thank you for such a fascinating talk, Professor. I wonder if are there Buddhist practices associated specifically with Manjushri, and like perhaps Wutai Shan, are there any specific Buddhist practice devoted to Manjushri?
Well, there is that practice I mentioned in connection with Jetwa. I don't know how commonly practiced it is today, but in earlier times, particular meditation routines that encourage the meditator to visualize the light emanating, the aura that's, it's commonly assumed that surrounding every sacred figure, every Buddha, is an aura, which in the Huayan tradition is expanded to the point where the Buddha's aura in the Huayan Jing does not just extend to the 6 feet around his body, but permeates the entire cosmos. There is a meditation ritual that was once practiced and may still be practiced that encourages the meditator to visualize the light of the Buddha and emanating from the person of the Buddha. This practice migrated from China to Japan. And in the tradition of medieval Japanese Buddhism, which combined Huayan, Japanese, so I say Kegon Buddhism, with esoteric Buddhism, which is called Ganmitsu in Japanese, Huayan and Mijao together. There was a monk named Myoe, who lived in the 11th, 12th century, who fostered this practice and describes it in great detail. Whether what he describes in detail in his meditation manuals is exactly the same thing that Jetwa had preached centuries earlier, we can't be sure. But it's not impossible that there's continuity. So visualization meditation, recitation of texts that became important in later Tibetan Buddhism. There's a text very important in Tibetan Buddhism called the Manjushri Nama Samgiti, where you recite the various names of Manjushri. For a time, beginning in the Yuan dynasty and continuing and accelerating during the Qing dynasty, Wutai Shan was as much a Tibetan center as it was a Chinese Buddhist center. And many of the important monasteries at Wutai Shan were monasteries for Tibetan monks. And they make use of this chanting ritual in which they recite the Manjushri Nama Samgati. So those are a few examples, right?
I don't know if you can answer this, but I was wondering if you discovered sort of about when Manjushri started being associated with Wutai Shan and in what form. Like, I can imagine fables or something, or stories or accounts of seeing him, but I don't know if...
Yeah, I mean, the legendary accounts of Wutai Shan's history say that Wutai Shan became an important Buddhist pilgrimage center in the late Han Dynasty. People don't believe that any longer. It seems to have developed as an important Buddhist center because of Manjushri's presumed presence there during the Northern Wei Dynasty, 4th century thereabouts, when Buddhist monasteries were established. There's some hints that before that happened, the 5 peaks at Wutai Shan were sacred in certain indigenous, maybe Taoist traditions, and each mountain had its own Taoist name, but it was taken over by the Buddhists. And the Huayan Sutra itself was very important in this process because there's a very important late 20th century European scholar of Buddhism whose work some of you may know, Etienne Lamotte, wrote a very important essay on the Manjushri 50, 60 years ago, in which he identified certain passages in the Huayanjing which were altered by Chinese redactors of the text to make it clear that one of the mountains mentioned in the sutra was actually Wutai Shan. And that may actually have been the part of the beginning of the tradition. The Chinese were delighted to have him living in their country. They're actually quite proud that China was blessed by the presence of Manjushri. He was also, Wutai Shan itself and Manjushri's presence there were valued because they were thought to protect China. You know, Wutai Shan is on the northern border of China proper, beyond it's only a few miles, not too many miles away from the Great Wall. Further north, you're in barbarian territory, which from which threats to China often came. And it was understood as a kind of protection of the nation from invasion and the like. But the further back we go in this, the mystier it all is, how exactly it was decided to make Wutai Shan the home of Manjushri, rather than just some mountain that was mentioned in the Sanskrit text of the Huayanjing. We know approximately when that happened, but how and why it happened, we don't really know. Right?
My question is, what chances are that Manjushri come to America and protect us?
Well, you know, there are, as I mentioned in connection with something else this morning, there's not only one Wutai Shan. There is the main Wutai Shan in northern Shanxi province, which we've been discussing this evening. But there are 3 or 4 other surrogate Wutai Shans elsewhere in China. One near Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty. One a little bit southwest of Beijing, which became recognized as a kind of version of Wutai Shan during the Liao Dynasty, when the border between China proper and the Liao Dynasty, the Khitan Dynasty, was difficult to traverse. People from China couldn't go to the Liao territory easily, and Liao Buddhists couldn't go down into the original Wutai Shan. So they found a set of 5 mountains a little bit southwest of Beijing, just a few hours drive from Beijing, even in bad traffic, which was called Xiao Wutai, Little Wutai, right? And there are 3 or 4 others like that in China. There's one in Korea. There were, I don't think any of the mountains in Japan were identified as surrogate Wutai Shans, but many of the temples on the original Wutai Shan there are Japanese temples named after and presumably designed by Japanese who had visited Wutai Shan and wanted replicas of those temples in their own country. So maybe you can follow the Japanese or the Korean model and create a surrogate Wutai Shan somewhere, I don't know, in the Rocky Mountains, right, where you can find 5 peaks that are close together, right?
Well, I think we should let Professor Gimello wrap up, for it's, I think, like 11:30 p.m. his time. But even if we don't have a Wutai Shan, I very much appreciate you bringing Manjushri here to us all to enjoy and consider. Let's give a big round of applause. More questions for him, and also would like to hear him talk some more. He's going to be giving some more talks when he's here tomorrow morning at 9:20. He will be talking for the Lotus Sutra class on Dharani. And giving
That would be the Juzi Dharani.
Dharani, and that will be here. And then tomorrow evening, we'll be giving a talk about Avatamsaka texts, and I think he's talking about the 6 marks.
Yeah, one of the important themes in the Huayan tradition of Huayan thought is something called the Liushang, the 6 marks or 6 characteristics. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about that as an example of the doctrinal side of Huayan Buddhism.
Hopefully some people can show up for that. Well, let's conclude tonight's lecture. Students, if you wouldn't mind really quickly filling out the feedback form for our symposium, and if a few of you can stay to help us. Oh, we don't have to put away stuff. No, that's right. So we can all go home and have dreams of lunch.